All right. Well, greetings. My name is Kellum Throgmorton. Welcome to the Crow Canyon Archaeological Center's webinar series. Today, we're going to be seeing a lecture by Dr. Benjamin Bellorado. It's called Decorated Walls and Tree Ring Dates South of the Bears Ears. And Dr. Bellorado is going to be filling us in on some really interesting work that he's been up to over the last, this is almost 4 years of work stretching back to 2013. I've been hearing about it along the way. I think you're really going to enjoy this. It's just some pretty fantastic stuff, a really interesting way, unique way to look at imagery, and then the stuff that he's managed to do with the tree ring dating to tie into that and think about changes in imagery and representation and cross-media representation. You're in for a treat. So first of all, I'd just like to say thank you to all of our viewers. It's been, I was just commenting a minute ago how it's been so incredible, the number of people tuning in, and that for those of us on the talking end of things, we're just thrilled to have such a large audience. You guys are the ones who are really making the difference. And as a nonprofit organization, we're really grateful for your interest and your ongoing support of Crow Canyon's webinar series. Here's a couple of just some things you might want to know about Zoom video conferencing. I think at this point, many of us have been doing this for a while, but on the off chance that you're very new to Zoom, one thing is you can move the talking heads. I assume that I'm some floating noggin in the corner of your screen. You can actually move that little box if it happens to be blocking some of the text at some point. There is a live transcription service available. I'll warn you right now, it sometimes struggles with archaeological terminology and Native American place names. So be forewarned, it's going to get things a little bit wrong at times. You can ask questions using the Q&A function. So you'll see, usually it's going to be down at the bottom of your screen. You'll hold your cursor there and a little toolbar pops up. For questions that are specific to Dr. Bellorado's work and that are focused on the content, you can use the Q&A function. We keep track of those. Myself and Taylor Hasbrook will be going through those. The chat function is supposed to be a little bit more conversational. We do bounce around and try to field questions from a variety of places, but the Q&A is the easiest spot. If you're having difficulties with the Zoom, you can also catch us live on Facebook, and you can head over to the live stream there, crowcanyon.org/Facebook. You can also catch this talk later on YouTube. We have a YouTube channel, and we always like to say to like and subscribe. And the reason for that is the more subscribers and likes we get on those two platforms, it helps us unlock different kinds of functionality. So it's not just shameless self-promotion. It actually does have a purpose as well. So our mission here at Crow Canyon Archaeological Center is to empower present and future generations by making the human past accessible and relevant through archaeological research, experiential education, and American Indian knowledge. For more information about us and what we do, you can find us online at www.crowcanyon.org. The Crow Canyon Archaeological Center acknowledges the Pueblo, Ute, Paiute, Dene, and Jicarilla Apache. These are the people on whose traditional homelands this institution sits and upon which we work and reside. Our mission-related work would not be possible without Indigenous people in the past, present, and future. We respectfully recognize and honor ancestral and descendant Indigenous communities for their contributions to all humankind. Crow Canyon is grateful to all Indigenous people and supports the preservation and protection of cultural traditions, ancestral connections, and sacred lands. Land acknowledgements like this are becoming more and more common in anthropology and archaeology, and I think that's really a great thing. I also like to point out to folks that you run a risk of it becoming rote, and we stop thinking about why we do it. So I really encourage you, wherever you are, to look into the places that you live and think about the Indigenous folks who have lived there before you or still live there among you. It's supposed to spark some introspection and dialogue. At least that's the way I see it. We've got a couple upcoming webinars that we'd like you to check out. Next week, we're going to have Prehistoric Irrigation in Central Utah, More Than at First Glance, with Dr. Steve Sims. I think I read an article that covers some of the research that they're looking at, and it was really interesting, talking about irrigation canals in places that we really haven't thought too critically about, that they might be there, that they might be, pre-contact canals. And then on Thursday, April 8th, we'll have The Lost City of the Monkey God with Douglas Preston. And that's another one to look forward to as well. If you're thinking of ways that you can make a difference, we've got a variety of places here that are looking for donations. If you really want to find ways to help out Native American peoples in the Southwest, the Pueblo Relief Fund is a great place to go. The Hopi Relief Fund, Navajo and Hopi Families COVID Relief Fund, and the official Navajo Nation COVID-19 Relief Fund. We've got links to all of these right here. These are good institutions. They're really doing their best to get help to the people who need it most, to get the most out of your contribution. And they've been really indispensable over the last year. A lot of tribal nations are still in various forms of lockdown, and there's been some real economic hardship. There always has been and continues to be economic hardship in these places. So if you're looking to make a difference, these are some good places to go. So now it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Benjamin Bellorado. He's a good friend of mine, been a colleague of mine for years. We were just chatting before the video started about how he actually helped me get my foot in the door as a young archaeologist some 15 odd years ago or so, when I was first working in Southeast Utah, close to some of the places he's going to be talking about today. Dr. Bellorado recently finished up his PhD at the University of Arizona. Some of the work that you're seeing today plays into what he wrote about in his dissertation, which if you haven't read it and you're interested in murals and you're interested in sandals and you're interested in kind of cross-media fashion and representation, check it out. It's worth reading. So I'm actually going to stop the screen share now, and I'm going to let Dr. Bellorado pull up his screen, and I will stop yammering, and we'll get on with the talk.
All right, let me see here. I'll check the screen. All right, share screen. Here we go, PowerPoint. All right, can you see the presenter view here?
Looks good on my end, Ben.
All right, so I'm ready to go. All right. Well, thank you all for coming. Good evening. My name is Dr. Benjamin Bellorado. I'm the laboratory manager here at Crow Canyon Archaeological Center. And as Kellen suggested, this presentation this evening is based on some of the dissertation research that I compiled into my final dissertation. And this is kind of a portion of it, and I'll be alluding to other pieces as we go. So let's see. There we go. So the area I'll be talking about this evening is in southeastern Utah. And so if you look on the left side of the screen here, you can see, the Four Corners states. Where I live right now in Cortez, Colorado, is part of what we locally call Four Cornea. It's where Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, and Arizona come together. And so in this lower map here on the left, you can see some of the archaeological cultures, at least as archaeologists define them, that lived in the ancient Southwest. So this little shaded area in the western Mesa Verde area is just north of the Kayenta culture, which is in northeastern Arizona. We're just due east of Glen Canyon, and just west of the central Mesa Verde area, which is where I'm speaking from right now in Cortez, Colorado. So where I'm going to be talking about today is the Cedar Mesa landform, kind of the greater Cedar Mesa landform, just south of the Bears Ears. But another way to think of this is in terms of the Bears Ears National Monument, or what we often refer to now as the Bears Ears region. So on the right, you can see in blue is the original designation of the Bears Ears National Monument by President Barack Obama in 2016. And then these red areas are the reduced monument boundaries that the Trump administration changed it to in 2017. But really, so the poignant part of this, there's a lot of things to say about that, but the introductory slide here shows just the area we're talking about is the southern portion of the Bears Ears National Monument. So before I get any further, I want to, again, acknowledge the lands that we're talking about. So the places I'll be talking about today are the traditional homelands of many of the clans and groups ancestral to the Hopi, to the Zuni, the Acoma Laguna, and numerous other Rio Grande River Pueblos, as well as clans of the Diné or the Navajo, Apache, and then bands of the Ute and Paiute peoples. And I am eternally grateful for all the indigenous peoples who continue to maintain their relationships with these and other ancestral landscapes, who fight for their protection and to work towards preserving and protecting cultural traditions for future generations. So the sites I'll be talking about this evening and that I've researched are really some of the most spectacular and significant in the Barrier Series area, but they're also the most fragile and threatened. So please, if you go to this area of the world and you see sites like this, and maybe even some of the sites I'm talking about, please visit with respect and help to protect our nation, our nation's cultural heritage. So in the southern Bears Ears, we have just an incredible array of rare and undocumented archaeological sites. There's dozens of canyons, and deep within these sandstone canyons, there are literally hundreds of intact Ancestral Pueblo cliff dwellings. Now, what I'm going to be speaking about tonight are some of the rare instances of building murals that exist in a number of these sites. And that some of these murals are in structures that also have potentially datable wood, which is really just amazing for us as archaeologists. Most of these murals depict textile-related imagery or landscape-based designs, and they're also, though, as I mentioned, they're under increased threat of destruction from over-visitation, vandalism, and looting as well. So here's just a couple examples of some of these. One of these sites is just perched on the edge of the shelf up above one of these deep canyons. In some of the structures, we see incised textile decorations like these sandals on the lower section of the screen, or a painted building mural that reflects both landscape imagery and probably cotton textile imagery. So before I get too much further, I want to get some of these definitions out of the way so you understand what we're talking about. So what is a building mural? Well, Watson Smith in 1952 really kind of defined what mural research was going to be for the next 50 years and to this day. And so he used a pretty broad definition of mural as an embellishment on the interior walls of artificially constructed buildings, both of a secular and of a ceremonial or esoteric nature. Now, most archaeologists follow kind of a narrow definition for this term, and that specifically applies to decorations of surfaces on man-made walls in architectural constructions, but especially on plastered surfaces. And here's a picture of Watson Smith documenting a mural at Wadavie. So mural research in the Southwest is still really in its infancy. Recent research suggests that murals were used to signal membership within distinct communities who shared common ideologies. They indicate waxing and waning of social ties and connections at local and regional scales. They functioned as backdrops for ritual performances in public and private settings. And they were repositories of social memory and social histories. And I'll talk more about what that means in a minute. Now, most of the murals in southeastern Utah that I'll be speaking about were made just before the large-scale depopulation of the region at the end of the AD 1200s. So here's a little bit of the theory I'll use, and then I'll be diving into some of this a lot more later on. But so clothing is often depicted in kiva murals. And that's really kind of the most common structures where these murals occurs in kivas, but sometimes in others. But so clothing is depicted in kiva murals, but clothing is also, in a way, dressing kivas. So it is basically the murals are clothing. And after AD 1300, special use clothing and adornments in other parts of the region, after this area was depopulated, often depict clothing. And so we can see on the far right here, this is a mural from Pottery Mountain Pueblo that was occupied between about 1400 and 1500 AD. And so we can see this depiction of a human, a bird, things, bowls and necklaces. Excuse me. So we really see kind of ritual costuming in action. We see textiles draped on the walls. You can see up here. Here's a depiction of this painted cotton textile from Poncho House, just south of the Cedar Mesa Bears Ears area. And we see similar types of textiles used to kind of clothe this structure. Really, it's draped on the walls. Also worn by this person. And what we think, we found is that kivas are really dressed, and what this does is it gives the structures identity. It animates them into social beings. For the Zuni Pueblo people in particular, this is still of great importance to this day. But there's really little known about this tradition and its origins. The Southern Bears Ears appears to have kind of the earliest depictions of clothing in murals, at least as we found so far. And this is the potential to shed important light on the dimensions of ancient social identities and religious ideologies. And really what it is clothing the world in a social skin. So in the Pueblo III period, ancestral Pueblo peoples in the Southern Bears Ears decorated their homes, their pottery, and the surrounding cliff walls with imagery of woven cotton and yucca textiles. And this includes sandals and blankets, belts, tump bands, and even looms. And I'll be showing you a bunch of those as we move through here. You can see some of, so here's a mural depiction of a cotton belt and a blanket, and then some of the actual drawings of the actual textiles. So you can see how similar they are. Similarly, you can see down in the lower right, twined yucca sandal, and then depictions of those sandals in rock art and mural imagery. But as I want to keep iterating or suggesting in this talk is that, these resources are in danger. And so while there's incredible evidence of murals and weaving tools and technologies in the Southern Bears Ears, and really they're more common here than other parts of the region, there's increasing threat from amplified visitation, historic and recent looting. So there's a very real need to document these resources before they're lost forever. And so this is one of the main reasons why many of us in southeastern Utah and archaeologists in the region are supporting increased federal protections for the area via the Bears Ears National Monument. So for example, you can see in the lower left, here's a kiva pilaster that somebody has scribbled their name, etched their name and the date into. This central picture here is a site that I had scouted to do some work at in 2014, I think it was, and then came back with a volunteer in 2015, and the site had recently been looted and it was really torn up. Of course, I notified the BLM immediately about that, and they were monitoring that. They were already aware of that situation. So this is something it wasn't just in the past. These sites are in danger now, and they're being damaged as we speak. So with all that in mind, in 2018, a number of archaeologists working in the area and Indigenous scholars came together and put together this Archaeology Southwest magazine specifically dedicated to the Bears Ears National Monument and the archaeology and Indigenous perspectives that are currently being circulated in the area. And so I encourage you to check that out if you get the chance. So with all that in mind, back in 2013, I started the Cedar Mesa Building Murals project. And the goals were pretty simple. It was to create a baseline data of these fragile resources. Basically, the archaeologist at the Bureau of Land Management that I was working with, Don Simonis, he said, we can't protect these sites. We don't know where they are, and if we don't know why they're important. So we need to get out there and just do this baseline initial recording and update previous recordings so we know where these things are and why they're important. And so the goals were also to aid federal land managers in the creation of management plans to help preserve and protect these sites. And then also I wanted to help descendant communities establish their ties and understand their relationships to these ancestral landscapes. I wanted to document the development of mural styles over space and time, and that was the mechanism I wanted to use to do these things. And also take tree ring samples from the intact wooden members of these structures. And what that helps us do is to establish regional chronologies and also assist in paleoclimatic reconstructions. And then through talks like this, and usually I really like giving talks in person as well, and we're all adapting the best we can to these situations. But through talks like this, I really wanted to help foster the preservation ethic for the general public. So, once all this seems fairly abstract, protecting these places, but once you actually see what is there and understand what it means, most people really, they'll come to the preservation ethic on their own. And that's what we want to encourage. Then, of course, this also contributed to my PhD research. And then I have to mention that the Canyonlands Natural History Association and the Laboratory of Tree Research, School of Anthropology at University of Arizona, and the National Science Foundation and the Florence C. and Robert Lister Fellowships all provided a great amount of funding for this project that was conducted in partnership with the Bureau of Land Management. So I have to thank them. So let's talk about some of the methods that we used. They're really light on impacts, and that was one of the main things the BLM specified is we can't hurt the sites, right? And we don't want to have any impact on the sites. So basically what I did is developed methodologies that were really light on the landscape. So we would hike to sites. I found out about a lot of these sites either through word of mouth or from the BLM folks I was working with, or by doing a file search, Edge of the Cedars State Park, where all the site files and forms are stored. And then we would hike to sites. We'd go check them out, places we thought could have a mural or might have a mural. And then once we found sites that did have these plaster decorations, we mapped them, we photographed just the heck out of them, and we document the sites, the structures, and then the murals themselves. Where we could and where it was appropriate, we took tree ring core samples from a subset of structures. So you can see in the lower left here, here's a structure that has this incredible 10-layer cribbed roof, and it has over 150 intact beams. Sometimes you can even see where the stone axe was used to cut them down. And so we'd take tree ring samples, and those are basically all we'd leave the site with, other than our notes and pictures. This little core is about as big as my pinky. And then we plug those up so no little bugs or anything would get in there, and we'd proceed to the next site. And then at a few sites, we tried a process called photogrammetry, which is basically how you create 3D models with just using a bunch of photographs. And that's really a very accurate way, kind of the most accurate way that we could actually document these murals, because you take this round structure or some kind of strange surface, and you try to turn it into a two-dimensional map. Sometimes you lose a lot of detail. But with photogrammetry, basically you can map these things in 3 dimensions with a 2 millimeter level of accuracy. So really incredible that we tried that out, and it's worked really well. So between 2013 and 2017 are when I conducted the field work, and it wasn't all just me. I wish I could take all the credit, not really. I worked with over 45 volunteers, and many of these were archaeologists in their own right that were working 40-hour weeks, and they would volunteer their time on the weekends or when they could take off and come over to southeastern Utah and help me document these sites, because they understand, like I do, how important and precious these places are. I also worked with a lot of more lay folks, people. Basically, my only requirement is, can you learn how to draw a map, and can you walk to a site? And I've got to work with a bunch of really great folks that way. We visited over 150 sites, and we mapped or sampled 28 different structures at 16 sites, and we found 97 new murals. Now that's incredible. So in previous documentation, really it was less than, well, maybe more than 97 if I think about that. Anyway, there were very few murals that had been documented previously, and so we really expanded what was known about this particular resource. We obtained 360 tree ring samples from select places of these sites, and then I dated these, and with the help of other folks at the Laboratory of Tree Ring Research in University of Arizona in Tucson, we dated 130 of these beams, and that's a 36% return, which is actually really good. The science of tree ring dating, you're usually kind of bet on 1 out of 3 samples actually returning a date. These dates range from the 860s all the way to 1268, which is 1268 is now tied with the previous oldest date from the southern Bears Ears area. So we matched up with that, and that was really, really amazing. So to give you an example of some of the documentation we're doing, or we've done, so on the left here, this is a map from 1978 of this particular site that's depicted in the picture on the right, and it had already been documented, previously documented. There was like a 5-page form, but methods have improved over the last 40 years, and so really, I don't want to say bad things about previous documentation and the work that folks have done, but really this map in particular was not very accurate and not adequate at all. You can see this this large cliff dwelling, one of the largest we have in the south of the Bears Ears, has about 20 rooms. And this is the map on the left, and it's kind of daisy chain of wall depictions. Really, it just wouldn't work. So we went back to that site. Oh, here's these first, second, third stories kind of shown here. We went back to that site, and this is just the middle level there. This is just that middle section of the site in the map that we did. We redrew this. And we drew in the beams. And now what that helps us do is not just establish this baseline data, which is very important, but then also when we draw the beams and we know when we take a sample out of there and we get a date on those samples, we know exactly where those dates came from. And so we can then reconstruct when specific buildings were built or remodeled. And then, of course, using that, we can infer when these murals were created. Okay. Like I said, we found a total of about 124 mural decorations in different structures. And then parsing out the data, it turns out that the murals in the south of the Bears Ears were made in one of 4 different ways. So we have incised decorations, inscribed decorations, painted bichrome decorations, and then encircling white band decorations. And there's a fair bit of variation we found across the area, but really they all kind of slot into these 4 methods and basically kind of technologically fit within this range. But so, that's great, but then we still have some pretty big questions to answer. So, for example, were the 4 styles of murals contemporary, or were they sequential? Were they similar murals made in other areas at the same time? And then how similar were the styles across the greater Cedar Mesa area? And how similar were they to the larger region? We'll get at that. So a lot of people ask me, how do you date a mural with tree rings? And some people thought I was drilling in to the side of a pilaster to look at the thickness of the plaster layers, and that's definitely not what we're doing. So basically what we do is a process called dendrochronology, and by putting that together with archaeology, it's dendroarchaeology. And so let me explain a little bit about how this happens, this process. So say, for example, you are working at a site where there's some live trees. So what you could do is go take a core sample from that tree. Here's this core sample you see in the upper bar here. And each one of those rings, each one of those lines represent a ring of a year of growth that makes a ring in that tree. Now, the relative thickness of the ring is reflective of the precipitation and the climate signature that tree experiences in its life. So fatter rings are happier years, basically when there's more precipitation. Narrower rings are drier years. And so that combination of thick and thin, thin and thick, basically can tell you the climatic signature that this tree responded to throughout its life. Then you go to, say, an older tree that's a dead tree. You take a core out of that from that same area. And then you start matching up these ring sequences. And they aren't usually purple or blue or green, but that's helps with this visual representation. And then basically what you can do is you can build these chronologies back in time, and then you eventually go to a collapsed structure. So these sites that we have in the Bears Ears, you take cores out of there and you can match those up with these master chronologies. Now, dendroarchaeologists have been at this for over 100 years, and we have some pretty robust master chronologies built up. So, for example, the Natural Bridges chronology, which is what we use for the area, goes back to, I think it's 93 AD. So we have that full length of time. And so when we go to our sites, like my good friend and mentor Tom Wines here, who showed me everything about tree ring sampling. You can see that you have to have that kind of look in your eye, and it takes a lot of energy. It's actually, you know, if you have this drill and you're coring into this beam, it's actually a lot of work. You can see in the lower picture here, I have that same look in my eye. You kind of have to have that wild look. But anyway, so we take these cores and then we'll go process them, and then we can match them up with that master chronology. So for example, the site I showed you that we did the maps for, the wall site, these are the samples that came out of there in the center here. And this is kind of the process. So we take the samples, and then we come back to the tree ring lab and we sand them down, so we can see a cross section in that core. And you can see these beautiful cross sections here. There's ponderosa pine, juniper, Douglas fir from this particular site. And you can see the differences, the variation in the ring thicknesses there. And then on the right, you can see a picture of me actually doing some of the skeleton plotting, which is this kind of older school way of doing the tree ring dating that still works very well to this day. So talk a little bit about some of the results of this. So what we figured out is that some of the incised murals seem to fall within a range of about 1210 or 1215, all the way to about really common in the 1240s and 50s, and then they kind of taper off, but they're still present until the 1270s. Most of these show depictions of, early on anyway, depictions of cotton textiles and yucca textiles like sandals and woven cotton belts and blankets. And then over time, there's a shift to more naturalistic forms. We see bird depictions or kind of plants like you see in the lower right here. I don't know if that's a cactus or a flower, but it's definitely not a woven textile. And then you can see this tracing I did of a photo actually showing a bighorn sheep. And that panel, that mural is really interesting because it actually shows a herd of bighorn sheep running across the wall. And then, there we go. And then we found a new style of mural that had never been identified previously to this project. And these are incised murals. And these were basically made on the outer surface of these Hakal walls. You can see the lower left, a really good example of a Hakal wall, where there are these upright posts and this lattice work of wood and brush. And then on one surface at least, they'll put a bunch of clay on there. And when that clay was still wet, somebody came through and actually drew some designs, I'll show you in a second, in the surface there. So we can actually lock in the specific, we know that mural was made exactly when that wall was created. So there are two sites where we identified these. Like I said, none had ever been reported before. This site on the left, Art House, has a bunch of masonry walls. And then this very last piece of construction in the upper left is this Hakal wall. Now, I really wanted to sample this, and I got permission to be able to do so, but I'm a very large person. I weigh about 250 pounds. And so one of my great volunteers, Aaron O'Brien, actually came out. He weighs about 100 pounds less than me, and we hauled some wood and an extension ladder and some pads out to this site so we could put it on this roof and spread out his weight, and he could take these samples without damaging the site. Then down below that, on a different occasion, the now curator of the Edge of the Cedars, John Fatil, came out and helped me document and sample some of these other beams. To be able to lock that in. Now on the right, there's another site over on the other side of the Mesa, and we were able to document that. And it's made of basically all the Hakal walls here. It's a really interesting example. So when we actually dated these, that Hakal wall site had this incredible wall that had collapsed before we got there, and it had all these inscribed sandal decorations in there. There was over 10 of them in just this wall here. As we looked around, unfortunately, most of the beams that made up that wall were cottonwood, which is a species that doesn't date, but we were able to find a few juniper logs and take a couple samples without damaging the site further, and that returned a date in AD 1238. Now it's really interesting. We only got one date though. But this wall here, the one at Art House I was telling you about, you can see on its outer surface, it's kind of hard to see, so I drew it. There's this series of 9 sets of 3 wavy lines that a person drug their fingers across the outer surface of this. So we took samples out of that wall. We got a number of dates, the latest of which was 1248. And basically, the specific dating return to this helped us to say that, this wall, at least the beams that were used in this wall, were cut down in either the fall of 1248 or the spring of 1249, before the growing season had started again. And that's one of the beauties of tree engravings. We can really get to be that accurate. And also interesting is that, these dates, even though they're the far sides of the mesa away from each other, these sites, when we compare those dates, these murals were made only 10 years apart. So that tells you, kind of gives you this chronological marker of when different styles might have come in. Now, the painted murals were a much trickier proposition. So unfortunately, most of the painted structures either didn't have any wood. So, for example, on the left here, this one site was built under a low alcove. So they didn't need to make a roof. They just put the walls all the way up to the roof of the alcove and didn't need to put any wood in there. Or they don't have any datable wood. Like I should explain, for cottonwood, if the sites use cottonwood, we can't date those because they're happy trees that the rings don't vary enough to be able to compare to these master chronologies because they grow near water. Or they're just really, really hard to get to. And that was definitely a tricky situation. In a few cases, so on this far right here, you can see there's this painted mural above this kiva. And unfortunately, in the early 1900s, late 1800s, there's definitely several instances where looters would throw the roof off the edge of the alcove. And so that's another reason why some of these structures don't have wood. So it's really hard to kind of pin that down. It was a hole for a while. The only example that we had was from previous research at a site called Moon House. And in the 1970s, the University of Arizona and Laboratory of Tree Research did just a ton of tree ring sampling here, and figured out that these walls, so here's this gallery with this painted mural that my colleague Eric Heller, Dr. Eric Heller and I are documenting, and it has this mural that's really kind of the quintessential painted mural from southeastern Utah. And what they figured out is this wall right here, shown in orange, that mural was painted on. After taking the tree ring samples, they figured out it was built probably in 1264 and maybe remodeled in 1267. And what that told them is that mural had to post-date that, right? Because you can't paint a mural on a wall that hasn't been built yet. And then the same with this other room, what's called the Moon Room, has a depiction of a moon here, we think, and then the other side, a crescent moon. Well, we can see the wall abutment sequences and some of the dates that came out of the room also say that it also was built sometime after the 1264, 1267. But that was really the only data point we had on these painted murals. So I looked high and low, trying to find painted murals with datable, potentially datable beams, and it was really tricky. But like I said, eventually we figured out that many of these structures with these painted murals are in just really difficult to reach places. So, for example, this site here is about midway up one of the deeper canyons, and it's a trek, but it's not that bad to get up to about this area where this tree is, above this tree. But from there, it looks like it might be a cakewalk, but well, the path is about this wide, and it angles down and it drops several hundred feet below. And these people, the Ancestral Pueblo people who made these sites, they were definitely worried about something. And it seems, these sites are often put in these really easily defendable locations. But for our purposes, we couldn't get equipment or people or volunteers in there safely. So it was a really tricky situation. But then with special permission of Bureau Land Management, I was able to do a bit of rope work. And so instead of having to scamper along those little shelves with our big heavy backpacks and clipboards and drills, we were able to climb or rappel into some of these sites. And we got help from professional climbers. So, for example, the center picture, Greg Child, not to be confused with Craig Childs, but Greg Child is a professional climber. He was really well known, or he still is, but especially in the 80s, he climbed Everest. He climbed K2 without oxygen. He lives in Moab. He's an Australian expat. He's really funny. And so he helped us get into some of these sites. And then another archaeologist, Pete Davis, helped us as well on another occasion. And then Josh Ewing and the Friends of Cedar Mesa helped us as well. And we were able to either rappel into or ascend up into a number of these sites. So it was a lot of work getting in there. And this is not the way that ancient people probably got into these places, but this was the most, the easiest and safest way for us to do it. So after all that work, then we found three new sites in particular that had really incredible examples of painted murals. So you can see this on the left, Angel's Rest, is this incredible site, and it had this exterior mural painted above a structure here, this red and white, kind of resembling mountains. The inside of the Crawl in Your Belly Kiva had this incredible painted bichrome red and white mural that has some kind of landscape elements. Excuse me, and that return dates between about 1240 and 1260. On the right, another structure that we mapped that had really never been mapped in very accurately at least. This site return dates between about 1240 and the early 1260s. So these incredible examples, and I think these are probably some of the best in the region, if not the world. Now, on the inside of that structure, here's a cross section I drew, and you can see these three plaster layers. I've kind of exaggerated for this diagram. You can see them on the left. So on the very interior layer, just on what we call the smoothing coat, when the structure was built, there was a sandal depiction that was incised into the plaster right after that structure was built, and then subsequently the structure was used, the accumulated soot, and eventually was replastered at least 3 times. And on the outer layer plaster, we found another style of textile, probably what we call a twill-plated sandal, incised into the outer layer. So that kind of tells us that throughout the use life of this structure, they were making incised decoration. So we put that on a timeline here, okay? So you can see 1150, 1200, 1250. This first bar is when the site was the structure was built. And then 1229 when it was remodeled, and then we project about a 15-year use life, and that's a figure that my colleague Mark Varian developed for earthen structures before they need to be substantially remodeled. These earthen and wooden structures can be lived in for about 15 years. So this is the time frame for this particular structure of when we think the mural was made. One data point is great, but we want more. So we went to another structure, this one in Natural Bridges, and it had, again, at least 3 layers of plaster, and I think probably many more, but 3 major layers of replastering. On the very outer surface, it had a bunch of literally hundreds of incised motifs, many of them these sandal depictions, but then also this belt and blanket I keep showing you. In the floor of that structure, there was also loom anchors. And so we think probably there was a loom like this one depicted on the right, suspended between the roof and the floor of that structure. Like I said, it had just a slew of incised decorations, so you can see some of those here. So we put that one on the time scale as well, right? And then we went to another structure that had both incised sandals, but then also painted on top of those, there were some painted decorations on top of the incising, and we got those dates back. It actually turned out to be a little bit later, so built in the 1240s, and then lived at least into the early 1250s, so a little bit later. So I don't want to belabor this, but basically this is then the seriation that I put together of all the dated structures that have murals in the area. And a lot of this was built, most of this was from my work, but then also some of my colleagues have done amazing work out there. So you can see all the way from basically the late 1100s all the way into the late 1200s here. Well, so if we kind of color code these, the different styles of murals, so you can see how we get to this process, and then eventually reorder those to where we can look at the different styles of murals and basically the development of the time sequence of when they were being used. So what this tells us is that early on we have these encircling white bands in the late 1100s and probably late 1100s. And then those seem to be replaced pretty quickly in the early 1200s by these incised decorations, like I've been showing you. The two inscribed murals came back right in the, like I said, just the late 1230s and early 1250s. And then there's a few examples where we have the superposition of incised with later painted. And then we have this painted tradition. And you can see that pretty early on in the late 1240s or 1250s, there's a pretty rapid spread of this style. And here's a few examples of these here. So let's talk about what this all means. So, you know, what's up with all this textile business in these murals? You know, what's this about? Pretty much, you know, like I said, across the board, this is really the most common type of thematic depiction, and often we find examples of cotton weaving tools and things. At least we think. And what does that all mean? And how can we get to that? Well, one of the ways that I learned about textiles and how to identify some of these things was a traditional technologies seminar in Oaxaca, Mexico. I went on that was sponsored by the Arizona Archaeological and Historical Society. And basically what the Arch and Hist did is they put together a team of native weavers from the Southwest, Pueblo weavers in particular, with a group of archaeologists and cinematographers to take us down to basically talk to weavers and folks that made textiles in Oaxaca, Mexico, where that's still a very vibrant tradition, and to get some interchange of both ideas and knowledge between the weavers in both places, and then also several of us were archaeologists. So Shelby Tinsdale is a culture anthropologist. Lori Webster here is one of the foremost experts on perishable technologies, an archaeologist, my mentor. And then Kelly Hayes Gilpin, also incredible archaeologist, works a lot with textiles and rock art and a number of things. And then myself, and then we had some cinematographers. And then right here you can see Akima Homeotua, Lou Garcia, Chris Lewis, and Mary Wahaki. And they were our weavers. And so I learned a whole lot. We went down, we got a number of demonstrations, especially on backstrap looms. So you can see here this interchange of knowledge. And we got about probably 8 different backstrap loom demonstrations. And you can see here on the left, just outside of Mitla, Oaxaca, this, what's his name? Arturo Hernandez, that's right. Basically showing us how this backstrap loom works. And both Louis and Chris had used backstrap looms, but they were just amazed at the techniques that these folks were using. Here you can see Akima just really looking at all the different number of shed rods this lady has, and she's weaving these textiles with these hand-dyed cotton materials. So there's this incredible interchange of knowledge. I even tried my hand at some things. I've done a lot of spinning, but not this way. And so I put my hand into spinning some this natural brown cotton with these ladies in a town called San Juan, Colorado. I felt right at home. And they're using these spindles with these beads, and they were just laughing. Oh my gosh, they had never seen a guy spin yarn, let alone a big white guy. I think I was probably the largest person they'd ever seen in their life. And we had a great time and learned a whole lot. And so, of course, as an archaeologist and having been working on this project, I took a whole lot of pictures of loom parts, and I really tried to focus in on those because I saw a lot of those at these sites. And so I wanted to look at the wear, how they were shaped, what the different names were, what the different pieces were that you'd need in a backstrap loom. And of course, in the Southwest, you have upright looms and backstrap looms. But it really did help me understand what I was looking at. So these are some of the textile-related materials I found in some of these sites in southeastern Utah. Everything from yucca tip leaf needles, yucca leaf tip needles, small weaving or shed rods, spindle whorls, wooden awls, loom anchors, and then even this weaving backing fragment. It really helped me kind of understand what I was looking at. Then later talking to Louis in particular, and Chris Lewis, like I said, they're loom weavers. This is on the right, you can see this depiction of this picture of a cotton textile that Louis wove himself. And actually, I think he grew the cotton for this one itself. And looking at some of the murals I saw, I thought I identified actually some looms being depicted on the incised on the walls of these structures. Then I also got to look at you could identify some of the weave structures themselves within these depictions. This picture on the lower right is another one of Louis' examples. On the left is this textile recovered by Noldenskjold from Mesa Verde, and then I compared it to my mural here. And you can see there's these ribs that are the result of this twill ribbing. Basically, it's when you skip, you go over, under, and then the next row you go under, over, and you keep going. Eventually, you get this diagonal rib that's kind of just inherent in the fabric. We see that depicted in this woven woven cotton belt in this mural. And then we can also see some of these interlocking. Basically, it's made with diamond twill tapestry. These step triangles interlock. So you can see that these murals weren't just made with some idea of a textile. They actually have some really inherent knowledge that probably were made by textile weavers, right? So they're actually made by probably experts who are making these depictions. Some other perspectives that were really invaluable to when I was looking at things were to talk to other Native people in the Southwest, including my friend Lyle Blancois, who's a Hopi archaeologist, jewelry maker, artist, and then also an incredible river guide. And he and I, thanks to Crow Canyon, were able to lead 2 different trips up into the Bears Ears a couple years ago. And then Friends of Cedar Mesa also had us lead a river trip on the San Juan. And I really hope that he and I can do that again because it was just really great. But so here we have a picture of him at the Citadel site, explaining some Hopi perspectives on these sites. And one of the things that I think is really interesting is that Hopi in particular really call out that they see the archaeological record and different archaeological sites as the metaphorical footprints of their ancestors, right? So not just depictions of feet or sandals, but all archaeological sites are basically these footprints, these fingerprints, these tracks of where different clans migrated across the landscape before they came to Hopi. And so when you think about then the actual footprints and actual sandal prints, I think that that has some pretty deep meanings. So, like I said, Hopis are one of the groups that are descendant from ancestral Pueblo people that lived in the area, and they see their sites as metaphorical footprints. And like I said, not just rock art, but other types of materials. And they're the physical and spiritual connections to their past. They're used to claim lands, to claim resources, and then as connections between places and things across the region. So generally, petroglyphs are known as Tetuveni, and I'm probably butchering that pronunciation, but I try, or footprint marks. And they're left as claimed ancestors migrated across the Southwest. So sandal depictions, in particular, may be these marks of individuals or groups that belong to specific clans or other organizations and their members, and we can see them across the landscape. Talking to other folks like Zuni, they help me understand that at least in their particular culture, and I think in others as well, structures are dressed, houses are dressed, especially during dedication rites. So think of replastering events as some of those other events of dedication rites. And they're used to animate structures, to give them identities. And these clothing helps to animate otherwise inanimate things. And this means that murals are literally the clothing that animates structures and gives them a type of personhood. And buildings in the Cedar Mesa area distressed landscapes are really some of the earliest examples that we have documentation for this region. So that is, I think, really exciting. Another thing I did is I did a lot of collections research myself, looking at these sandals. And Dr. Lori Webster was one of my committee members in my dissertation, and she and I went to the American Museum of Natural History and looked at a bunch of these sandals from the Southwest, some of these earliest collections, and figured out how we should document them. And then I went to 6 other major museums, like the Smithsonian's and the Peabody at Harvard and a number of others, and then 10 local museums in the Southwest to document these sandals and then date some of them. So of all the sandals that we have, they're really the most frequently recovered type of textile in the Southwest. There are these twined yucca sandals are the ones that are often depicted. Here we can see a comparison of the actual sandals and some tracings I did, particularly these raised treads on the bottom surfaces. So they would have left really specific marks when you walked in them in soft soil. But that's what we see depicted in both rock art and then these building murals, is these raised tread decorations and then the outline of the sandal. It's just an example of some of the different raised treads that I documented in these examples. And when I looked at these across the region, I found that certain tread designs were more common in certain places than in others. So, for example, in the Middle San Juan and Aztec West, that big site over there, this isolated shape design was most common. In Kenny Deshay, it's these columns of dots and dashes. But in southeastern Utah, we have these diagonally oriented designs that were the most common, kind of the local signature then. You can see when you saw the footprints of somebody who wore these, basically you would be able to tell, at least generally, the location of where they came from as you saw these footprints across the landscape. So that's kind of the meaning they have. Then one of these sandals, I was able to get a AMS date, a fancy kind of radiocarbon date from the American Museum of Natural History. This sandal was actually recovered in the 1800s. Late 1800s from Grand Gulch. And you can see I've taken the picture and I've drawn the tread where you can still see it, where it's not worn out. And if we compare that to one of the mural depictions, so you can see the mural depiction here and the tracing I've done of the photo, you can see that that's nearly identical in that raised tread. So again, it emphasizes that these aren't just the idea of sandals that people are drawing, they're actually specific sandals, and by analogy, then probably the specific sandals that belong to certain groups or certain people, maybe even individuals here. And so we compared the dating of those. They said this structure was built after remodeled after 1216, and that's probably when this mural dates to. Well, the AMS date falls 1215 to 1266, so overlaps nearly perfectly. That's what we like to see, these different layers of evidence. The sandal murals, the murals with sandal depictions are really isolated to this southern Bears Ears area. You see there's a few other examples in other parts of the region, like at Chaco Canyon, there's a few examples, but really this is a unique thing into our area. Sandals also show up in rock art, especially in routes of travel. I documented actually over 550 different depictions, and most of those, again, are in southeastern Utah. And in the Bears Ears area, they seem to show up at the junction of major routes of travel, either off the rivers, up into the canyons, or along Comb Ridge. But then about 1250, late 1240s, 1250, something major changed in the area. And we see that incised murals basically start to fall out of favor. I said they kind of seem to be replaced by those painted designs. But we do see a few examples in other parts of the region here where I don't know if people might have left and gone to these places. That definitely is a possibility. Or maybe this style, since it hadn't really been reported on much, has just gone unrecognized. But we do see it after the 1250s in other places. So there might have been an early out migration out of the Bears Ears in that time. But over time in the Bears Ears area, we see that there's this progression basically from incised to painted depictions. And not only did the depictions change, but the sizes of the spaces that they were used in or that they were made in also increases. So that tells us that maybe the audience of who is meant to see these things got larger, or that audience changed. So we can see it goes from inside small kivas to larger structures and galleries, and then sometimes even on the outside of the structures you can see from long, long ways away. And so we see this change in more larger and more visible garments, including shields. And I compared the sizes of these textiles. We can see that this change in murals actually mirrors the change in the textile sizes themselves. So what that tells us is that there's these idealized landscapes and shield depictions and other types of things, shows us that there was kind of a change to much larger audiences in which murals were intended to be seen. And then maybe there was some type of conflict or other things going on because these sites are also in more precarious places. Now, again, starting in the 1250s, but then moving into the 1270s, it looks like people really started to leave this landscape. But when they did, they brought these mural styles with them. And so this painted style, we actually, through the dates I was able to obtain, figure out that it actually is earlier, at least in terms of the evidence we have now, in southeastern Utah, in the Bears Ears, than it is in other parts of the region. And so we can see the distribution of where these bichrome murals show up. And it looks like there might be this kind of out-migration, or maybe there's even recruiting of these people from these other areas. And so we call these earth bands or landscape designs. And we can see just kind of the variation that occurs in the region. Now, there's some really neat similarities that tells us that there's probably, that these are people talking about the same, communicating the same types of messages, but then there's also some very important differences. And we can talk about those a little bit later. So I'm almost out of time, so I want to wrap up with some conclusions here. So first of all, some murals mainly occur in kivas and habitation rooms, and they're really common though across the greater Cedar Mesa or southern Bears Ears landscape. Most rooms with murals also show signs of evidence of cotton or yucca textile production. And murals were the repositories of social memory, social histories, where ideas about the world and society were made and then later covered up and then remade. They were a reflection of current social and political processes in the surrounding world. Murals function in part as clothing for buildings and to describe them with identity and personhood. And murals transformed kivas into microcosms of the world and were decorated in similar ways as the larger landscape. So think sandal tracks on the landscape and on the cliff walls, but also in the structures. And then these landscape-based motifs, also in the kivas, but then on the bigger landscape. So the dressed buildings of the greater Cedar Mesa area and the southern Bears Ears, again, are some of the earliest examples we have of this tradition, and then now the most well documented. More specifically, we can talk about, so the incised murals seem to signal a type of shared identity that was shared across the local southern Bears Ears area. After 1250, incised murals start to kind of wane in their popularity, but they start to show up in other places. And this could signal kind of an out-migration into the larger region, or just that this style has gone unrecognized. Really hardly anybody talks about it. So maybe there's just a lot more of them that we don't know about. And then also the development of the painted bichrome earth bands, or these bichrome murals with landscape imagery, seems to signal some type of new social or religious movement that appeared first in the Bears Ears, potentially, at least based on the dates we have right now, and then moved to the east and to the southeast into the Mesa Verde region, and even down in the Canyon de Chelly. So while there's similar styles of murals were shared across the region at certain times, the trajectory of murals and their development in the southern Bears Ears was unique to the area. There are some similarities, but we have this kind of unique development in this region, which is incredibly interesting and important. And so, and it's not just that they're different, but the Bears Ears folks probably had some type of pretty major influence on murals that show up later on in other parts of the region. So for the next steps, I have some reports that I'm finishing up that I have to send to the federal land managers and funders. And then I really want to present the results of this project to the descendant communities. Now, I've drawn on a lot of influence and perspectives of Native folks and throughout my work, but I also want to take this to these different communities and present the results of this research to help them understand maybe things they don't know about this particular area, or what type of sites there are. And then I also working with the BLM and some colleagues to create an exhibit a virtual reality exhibit using some of this photogrammetry that will then help educate the public, and then hopefully with the collaboration and consultation with tribes, help to be used for tribal education. And then I want to continue my research comparing these on a regional scale, and also continue my analysis of the twine sandals and the comparison between the murals, rock art, and the actual sandals and other textiles themselves. Last thing I'll leave you with is just remember, these resources are in danger. And there's a very real need to document these resources before they're gone. Whether or not the monument boundaries are expanded or contracted or what, we still need to go and document these places, because people know about bears ears now, and people want to see these places. And we need to find a way that we can safely and responsibly share this information with people to help them generate their own archaeological preservation ethics. So there's a slew of people I want to thank, particularly my volunteers. That so much, 45 volunteers. It was incredible. All the native and federal land managers that I worked with, the private land organizations, the Friends of Cedar Mesa, my dissertation committee, of course, my funders, the Canyon Lands Natural History Association, the Lister Fellowship that's run through Carp Canyon, the U of A, especially the Laboratory of Tree and Research and the School of Anthropology, and then all the different curators and collections managers I worked with at the various museums I went to. So I'm sure I'm leaving some people out, but I don't intend to, but I know we're running out of time. So thank you so much. And if anybody wants to ask any questions, I'm very willing to do my best and try to answer them. Thank you.
Ben, that was great. That was really quite a walk through a lot of material and a lot of very interesting and exciting places. We do have a bunch of questions, and I'm going to try to kind of group a few of them together and tackle a little bit of them at once. Maybe we can knock out a couple of sort of clarifications. First of all, one question that has been asked is, what is the difference between incised and inscribed? Are there similar techniques, the same technique?
Good question. Here, let's just flip back here, give everybody a stick to their stomach. So inscribed, it's not letting me go further. There we go. Right here. So inscribed are made when the plaster on the surface of these call walls, and the only place we found these two call walls, actually I know a couple other ones now, but we didn't date them, but when that plaster is wet, somebody took their finger and drew the designs when that plaster was wet, and then it dried, and then they didn't make any other decorations. So we know it was made right when that wall was built, which is really cool. But if we go back to incised, that's when it's carved basically either with a flake of rock or maybe a bone tool or something into the dry plaster layer. So that's incised, so carved, if you will, versus inscribed, which is when it was wet.
Excellent. Well, that clears it up for me too. There's also a question about the loom anchors and the construction techniques. A couple of those looked like they were made out of stone, but I think there's, if I understand right, a couple of ways, and just wondering if you can describe those, the loom anchors.
I can do this a little without making us all sick. Oh, I'm still trying to share. Darn it. Hold on. Let's see if we can do that. Can you still see the screen? It's the not presenter mode?
Yep, we can see you scrolling through your slides.
Okay, yeah. So here is a great example. This particular kiva on the left here, these are the actual loom anchors. These ones are actually made of twigs of willow that have been bent over. And basically, they dig a hole in the floor of the structure, and then they take this bent over loop, and actually, usually they tie, they wrap it with some other twigs, and then there's almost always a corn cob in there. It's really interesting. And then they tie it up, and they'll put it in the floor, and then they plaster around it. So it's just kind of the loop that's above the ground. There's other styles. So when you see this depiction here, this is from Kate Kent's 1983 textile book. But this has these kind of toggles that are dug in the floor as a piece of wood, and then a strap coming out, and the strap emerges from the floor. We do see those, and actually that's an interesting. There's slew of follow-up studies we could do with all this data, and I hope to do those eventually. But there's actually like probably 5 different ways that the loom makers were created. And they seem to kind of pattern out across the landscape where, in any one structure, they only used one type, at least as far as we can tell. But yeah, they're definitely really interesting. Some were drilled in the bedrock. Some were these loops, some were toggles. I even came across an example where they dug a narrow trench in the floor and put a long stick then in that trench, and then use that as the anchor then to put these loops on and filled it in. So a lot of variation there, which is really interesting.
Excellent, thank you. Thinking about the murals and textiles, there are a couple of questions asking, are there other interpretations for these kinds of murals? And also, is there a possibility that some of these are sort of mnemonic devices for if weavers are working in these structures and they've got these patterns on the walls? Is there a connection there as well?
Right. Yeah. No, I definitely think there could be, and that's one of the great things about working with Native people and talking with natives about their perspectives is, maybe in Western science we like to think that there's one answer. It's this one thing. It's a mnemonic device, or it's a metaphor. It's all of those things. So like I said, I think these are weaving rooms in particular where, because we see a lot of textile production materials, but then, and like I said, there's often really clear-cut depictions of certain types of weave structures that only say the weavers would know. And so they might be using these to either track those structures or certain designs that then other people can replicate later in time. So that's definitely a possibility. But I also think, there's some pretty deep metaphors ingrained in these. You don't see, we see, as I said, eventually over time, we do see some more naturalistic forms, but those are pretty rare. And these textile images are so pervasive. It was definitely, that was the theme. And so ideas of dressing structures and dressing landscapes, I think, is really, really inherent at the base of that.
Is there any way to know, well, I guess it's how many kivas are decorated? Is this a common technique amongst kivas, or are there plenty of places where kivas are not decorated in this fashion? Is it a quirk of preservation, I guess?
Yeah, well, that's a big piece of it, So, my sample is primarily the 1200s, and that is almost entirely due to the fact that prior to the 1200s, most people lived up on the Mesa tops. So most of the sites are open air, and so we just don't have the same level of preservation for one. These structures basically come pre-excavated. They're just intact. We can go in there and see these layers without having to do any type of disturbance. So there's definitely a preservation issue. And so, that's also limited. And even within those, there's a lot of variation in the preservation too. So there's a lot of structures where you just know there was a kiva. Maybe you see some just hints there was plaster. But in certain examples, and those are the ones I really tried to focus on documenting, there's, you can see just this kind of myriad of different designs. But like I said, nobody had documented the inscribed murals, and I think there's more of them out there. I think we just weren't clued into it. But the same with the incised depictions, and those in the painted were the most common, but really it was the incised are the most common. And prior to this work, only about a handful of different reports from across the big greater Southwest had identified incised murals and really kind of linked them to being the same type of thing. When I started this research, I actually got a fair bit of flack. People were like, oh, that's not a mural, it's just a bunch of scratchings. And I was like, no, this is basically, it fits that, it falls within the same type of structure. It's not the same as the fancy painted ones we all think about, but it's fulfilling that same social role. And so I think that those have just gone really unrecognized, and we need to keep our eye out for them throughout the region. But yeah, it's, like I said, across the Southern Bears years for the early 1200s, this is a very common style, and it's most kivas probably had it. It seems to be kind of the thing, just the way that we think of that as, your habit is the way of doing. The way you conceive of these structures to make it whole and complete, you plaster it, and then you you dress it, and that's part of the dedication. That's part of what makes it, finished. So yeah.
Yeah, no, that seems really apt. And certainly in the few cases that I've seen in open air sites, when the preservation is good enough, the same similar imagery is there. Like the Haney site, there used to be kiva murals on some of those when they were first excavated, and it's an open air site, maybe a little bit earlier than some of what you're talking about here. I think it dated to 1110 or something like that. Although
that was the first mural I actually ever documented for Susan. She had us out there when I was working for her before and lit a fire. There's other styles in the other parts of the region, especially in the Pueblo II period. We know, especially from a lot of great houses, we know there's these other styles that were being used that were also painted earlier on. So the trajectory in southeastern Utah, and that's one thing I try to emphasize, is different than it is in southwestern Colorado. Not better or worse, but just different people, groups of folks are doing different things. But across the Bears Ears, this incised tradition really shows there's connection. People are it's this community of practice. This is the way people do it because that's how they learned how to do it, and that's how they think of it as right and proper. They aren't really thinking probably like, oh, well, in the Central Mesa Verde area, people are doing murals this other way. We're going to do it differently. It's just the way that they do it, and vice versa. So, there's a lot more to understand about this tradition, both in the Bears Ears, but then in the larger region as well.
Do you care to speculate about the folks who might have been involved in textile production within these spaces and in mural production? Do you have an idea of that? Is that a special social group? Is it restricted to a particular gender? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So at least historically, we know that in many of the pueblos, men were primarily the weavers of textiles. Women were primarily the potters and the basket weavers. Although, of course, there's a lot of lenses we're looking through to kind of think that way, but that seems to be generally pretty apt. Who decorated the structures? I know at least the work that I've read from Hopi suggests that the women were the ones that did the plastering of the inside of the structures. I don't know if that's just habitations or if that's kivas as well. We also have to think that kivas in this sense are maybe are ancestral, but different than the kivas as we conceive of from modern pueblos today. So they weren't solely these ceremonial kind of religious facilities. In this time period I'm talking about, they're also kind of the primary domestic structure of individual families. And so each family probably had their own kiva. And so since each one is decorated, I think that at least it occurred on probably the familial level, at least for the most part. Now, that's not to say that certain structures in certain places didn't take on more important meanings that would have been the central focus for, certain groups that would come from other places. So like I said, that's some speculation. But my sense is that, maybe it was men, because if the men were the weavers, and like I said, there's these really intricate depictions that show some of these weave structures that maybe only the weavers would know about, then that would suggest that it was those same folks, again, men, that would be doing those depictions. But that's speculation.
Well, there's more questions. If you're willing to keep going, I'm willing to keep.
I could go for a little while, sure. Yeah. It stopped snowing out, I can see, so I'm good.
Oh, nope. Yeah, you'll still be able to get home.
No, I'm happy to talk about this stuff. I love it, obviously.
So a couple of questions that came in early were in regards to the sandals, and thinking a little, I know you've gone into greater detail about the sandals in other talks. It's a big part of your dissertation. Yeah. So part of that question is, what are the sandal connections telling us? What might be, the Echeritas talk a little bit about the toe jog and the use of the toe jog as a particular symbol, and what kind of extra local connections might be referenced by this particular mural style and sandal style.
Well, I could go. I always throw a couple extra slides in from previous talks. So these twine sandals, especially in the Pueblo II and Pueblo III period, they're shaped for the left and right foot, and they have these toe jogs often on the outside edge. Recent research by Patty Crown and others has shown that at least in Pueblo Bonito, there's this ruling lineage, or probably the founders of at least part of Pueblo Bonito, and it was a matrilineal descent group. There's a lot to that, but it seems pretty solid. But some of those individuals had a condition called polydactyly, which is where they had 6 toes on one or both feet, basically an extra small toe. There's different ways that can happen. But they were a really important group. And so the idea is that people added these toe jogs on the side of their sandals to kind of as a citation to either to connect with those important leaders. And either maybe they wanted to show that they're descended from them, or that they wanted to be, they're connecting with that power. Now, some of that research had suggested that that jog was added really early on, but when I looked at these sandals, actually, that was a big thing I did was try to look at the toe shapes and when toe jogs were created. And they really didn't come into fashion. They weren't a thing, at least on the twine sandals, until actually the 1060s. And so that's founding lineages at Bonito started at probably about 850 AD. So this is a couple hundred years later it took before that became a thing. Again, probably a citation. And it was really common in the middle San Juan. If we actually look at the distribution of the actual sandals in Southeast Utah, very few of them, or I should say, only about a third of them have the toe jog. So it wasn't popular everywhere. But when I looked at rock art and other types of depictions, they're really, really common, especially these toe jogs. And so this shows us that like across this huge piece of landscape, 185 miles as the crow flies from Chaco Canyon, where we also see those depictions, all the way up into southeast Utah here. So some of my sites along the Colorado River, the kind of furthest extent. Whatever that was, it was something everybody was talking about. It was important, especially in this between the late 1000s and 1300, and probably kind of the later end of that. But so then that also establishes connections then with southeastern Utah and Chaco Canyon, and then the events that were going on everywhere in between. So this was I think it probably was a really important political symbol that spread really quickly across the landscape, and then kind of came to take different meanings in different places over time. So I could wax more poetically about sandals if you want.
Well, I think you've got another lecture all about that. So we might, we might save that one, keep it in the can for later. But that does raise a question, and that is, how can people find more of your work? How is some of this available, and is there any place you'd like to direct folks who want to learn more, both about you and perhaps about the Bears Ears area in general?
Yeah, well, that magazine that Arc Southwest put out was great. It's got, I've got my dissertation is 600 pages long. You can look at that online. I think Academia EDU has copies. But if you want a shorter, sweeter version of my own work and other archaeologists' work in the Bears Ears area, pretty recently produced, was this Sacred and Threatened. And produced by Archaeology Southwest. I got a copy right here, but that has 1-2 page little short, sweet articles with lots of pictures that kind of give a reader a good sense of the recent archaeological work going on in the area, and then some native views from a number of different native folks from the different tribes in the Intertribal Coalition to support the Bears Ears and what they think about the area. So I'd say that's a really good place. I have several publications that are in the works right now, both popular and academic, and so hopefully those come out pretty soon. Let's see here, and then I have several journal articles that one could look up. Especially Google Scholar is a great place to look for people's work. It's not Google Earth, it's Google Scholar, and then you type in somebody's name, it will show you basically all of their publications and really directs you how to see most of them. So it's pretty comprehensive. If somebody was looking specifically for your dissertation, is that going to be through like the University of Arizona's library website? Where
you don't have an. I've noticed some people have like an embargo on it for a year. Is yours should be?
I've been debating about that. Yeah, in one hand, I want to get the work out, and the other hand, I also want to publish on my own work. But at the moment, there's not an embargo, and you can get it, like I said, through Google Earth, or sorry, Google Scholar. I'm confusing myself. Is really the best way to look that up, and you can actually download it off of that, and it's copyrighted. So, but yeah, and also if you want to email me at Crow Canyon, I am more than happy to share some of my work, and I have a number of digital copies of my various articles and book chapters and stuff that I can send folks.
Excellent. Well, Ben, thanks so much for sharing with us today. Thank you for walking us through your research. Thanks for such a deft hand at describing these different kind of ways that different kinds of media line up. This is really illuminating, and I think you've done a wonderful job. So I've really enjoyed this. I hope that you have all enjoyed it as well. Don't forget to tune back in next week. We'll have some more lectures available for you. Next week's going to be talking about possible irrigation canals, pre-contact irrigation canals in parts of Utah. And just want to give another thank you to Dr. Benjamin Bellorado for a wonderful lecture.
And thanks. Thank you, Kellen. And thanks to Taylor and Dylan for helping set this all up. And thanks to Crow Canyon for setting this whole program up.